We're always searching for these super high-tech, futuristic solutions to our biggest problems. But what if the answer to one of our most urgent urban crises has been hiding in plain sight for, about 700 years? Let's dig into how some really old wisdom might just be the key to cooling down our future. We've all felt it, right? That relentless summer heat in the city. All that concrete and asphalt, it just soaks up the sun's rays, basically baking the streets and cranking up the temperature way higher than the countryside around it. It's called the urban heat island effect, and it's literally turning our modern cities into ovens. So what do we do about it? Do we just need bigger, more powerful air conditioners? Some kind of smart, space-age materials? Maybe. But what if the best solution isn't new at all? What if the actual blueprint for a cooler, more livable city was already perfected back in the Middle Ages? Yeah, I know. For a long, long time, modern city planners kind of laughed at medieval cities. They called the winding, narrow streets the pack donkey's way, which was basically their snarky term for something they thought was just chaotic and inefficient. But it turns out there's a really powerful hidden logic in all that so-called chaos. And when you put them side by side, the difference is just crystal clear. You've got the rigid, geometric grid of a modern city designed for cars, and then you have the organic, kind of messy layout of a medieval city, which grew naturally from people just walking around. And the big surprise? That ancient, chaotic design is way, way better at regulating its own climate. It's just naturally more resilient. To really see this in action, we have to go to Bologna, Italy. This city is famous for having nearly 62 kilometers of covered walkways. They're called porticos. But here's the thing, they weren't part of some grand master plan. They actually got their start as an illegal hack to solve a housing crisis.
So, picture this. It's the 12th century, and students are flooding into Bologna for its new university. Suddenly, there's a massive housing shortage, so landlords get creative. They start building these illegal upper floor extensions, called sporti, that literally jutted out over the public street. Now, for decades, this was just an illegal workaround. But then, instead of tearing them all down, the city did something absolutely brilliant.
It was a pragmatic stroke of genius. Seriously, instead of fighting a battle they couldn't win, the city government just legalized the structures in 1288. They took this messy, informal solution to a real problem and turned it into a permanent defining feature of the entire city. And the genius was all in the new rules. They said, okay, landlords, you can keep your extra space, but you have to replace the old wooden beams with stone columns, you have to guarantee the walkway underneath is open to everyone, and this is my favorite part, you have to make it high enough for a person on horseback to ride through. How cool is that? It was simple, elegant, and it completely transformed the city. So this created a whole new thing, what we might call a legal hybrid. The apartments upstairs were private property, but the ground level space right below them was legally required to be for public use. It's this perfect blend of private ownership and public good, just baked right into the city's DNA. Okay, so that's a cool history lesson, but how does this all circle back to our original problem of scorching hot cities? Well, this is where the story gets really, really interesting. That 700-year-old fix has now become an unbelievably effective piece of modern climate-fighting infrastructure. This number says it all. 15 degrees Celsius. That's how much cooler the felt temperature can be when you're standing under a portico on a hot day versus standing out on an exposed street. This chart just shows you that incredible difference. Now, the actual air temperature might be the same, but because the porticos block the direct sun, it can feel up to 15 degrees cooler. It's simple geometry, and it makes the entire city comfortable and walkable, even in the middle of a blazing hot summer. And the benefits go way beyond just shade. The porticos protect people from rain and wind in the winter. They passively cool the buildings they're attached to, which cuts down on energy bills. They create this amazing sheltered space for cafes and shops, and they form a seamless, weatherproof network for pedestrians that makes you want to walk instead of drive. And that, right there, is the heart of it. This is a truly sustainable design that works because of its geometry, its physical shape, not because it's chugging massive amounts of energy like a modern AC system. It's just smart. And listen, this isn't just some random fluke that happened in Bologna. It's actually a perfect example of a much bigger design philosophy that made a lot of medieval cities incredibly resilient. There's a concept for this. It's called evolutionary resilience. And it's not just about a city bouncing back to normal after a big shock. No, it's about the city's ability to bounce forward, to adapt its original features and give them entirely new purposes to face new challenges.
And Bologna is not alone here. Just look at Krakow, where the old defensive city walls have been turned into beautiful urban parks. They're basically the city's green lungs now. Or think about Venice, where its ancient canal networks are being totally reimagined as critical tools for flood control. All over the place, old medieval designs are being repurposed to solve modern problems.
So, what's the big takeaway for our own cities? Well, it suggests that maybe we need to completely rethink the purpose of our streets, to restore them as spaces for people, not just highways for cars. And Bologna today is leaning into this legacy hard. When the city lowers speed limits or creates more pedestrian-only zones, they aren't forcing some radical new idea onto the city. They are simply restoring the street to its original medieval purpose, a purpose that was literally built into its foundations by those very same porticos.
In cities up in Northern Europe, like York in England, they did something totally different. They couldn't go out, so they went up, with each floor literally hanging over the one below it. It's a technique called jettying.
Okay, so let's zoom in on York for a minute and see exactly how this whole building up thing played out. We're gonna head to its most famous medieval street, the Shambles. And this place has history. It was originally a street for butchers. It's even mentioned way, way back in the Doomsday Book. Its design is it's a total masterclass in medieval problem solving. And here it is. This is that jettying technique in action. You can see how each timber frame story juts out just a little bit further than the one below it. And the result is this incredible, almost magical effect where the buildings on opposite sides of the street get so close they nearly touch. They nearly kiss. What you're looking at is what urban climatologists have a name for: a deep urban canyon. So to really get why this matters so much, we have to talk about a key scientific idea. It's called the sky view factor, or SVF for short. And don't worry, it's actually super simple. Basically, it's a score of how much sky you can see from the ground. A score of 1, that's a wide open field. You can see everything. A score close to 0, well, that's like being at the bottom of a deep, deep canyon. Now check out how extreme this gets. An open square, yet it's gonna be almost a perfect 1. A typical modern street might be, say, 0.5, but the Shambles, whoa. Its sky view factor absolutely plummets to less than 0.1, basically 0. So this isn't just a narrow street we're talking about. It's a true man-made canyon. And that one single design choice has had massive, massive consequences that are still playing out today. And right here, this is where we get to the absolute heart of the story. Because that brilliant medieval solution to their space problem, well, today, in the 21st century, it's become a classic double-edged sword. It's created this whole cascade of really complex and often totally conflicting trade-offs. Okay, first up, climate. The good news? That super low sky view factor creates this amazing permanent shadow in the summer. Back in the day, that was perfect for the butchers trying to keep their meat from spoiling. And for us, today, it's a fantastic little refuge from a brutal heat wave. But here's the bad news. That exact same canyon effect that keeps it cool during the day, it traps heat from the buildings at night. It just can't escape, so the street can't cool down properly. And even worse, back when cars were allowed, it would trap all that pollution, basically turning this cool refuge into a toxic hotspot. So to deal with that really serious pollution danger, the city of York brought in a pretty aggressive policy they call foot streets. What does that mean? Well, they essentially banned most cars and trucks from these narrow medieval arteries during the daytime. They basically said, nope, these streets are going back to what they were originally for: people. And the result? Oh, it worked big time. Air quality reports showed a 27% drop in peak nitrogen dioxide pollution in some of the key spots. Just think about that. By getting rid of the cars, the city completely neutralized the canyon's biggest modern danger and let its natural cooling benefits really shine. I mean, that's a massive win for public health. But you know how it goes. You solve one problem, and you accidentally create a new one. By making the streets pedestrian only, they brought the people back in huge, dense crowds. And that, unfortunately, introduced a totally new, very modern threat: terrorism. And this is where things get really complex, because it creates this fascinating security paradox. So on the one hand, the threat of vehicle as a weapon tax means you usually need to install these huge, heavy barriers. But York's winding, narrow streets, they're already a kind of natural defense against a speeding car. A car just can't get up to speed. Here's the paradox, though. The very same features that stop a car also create these narrow choke points. They pack people together so tightly that they become what security experts call a vulnerable soft target for other kinds of attacks. It's a real catch-22. But the dominoes kept falling.
The solutions they came up with for pollution and for security, well, they created yet another problem. And honestly, this one might be the toughest and most personal one of all. It's about inclusivity.
This really gets to the core of a major human rights debate that's happening in York right now. The big question is preserving history worth sacrificing modern accessibility? Because that vehicle ban has been heavily criticized for basically excluding disabled residents, they're called blue badge holders there, who absolutely rely on their cars to get into the city center. So you've got this head-on collision between historic preservation on one side and social equity in a modern city on the other. Okay, so this brings us full circle. Remember Bologna from the beginning? Let's go back to them for a second. Could their medieval solution actually offer a better path forward for us, especially with our climate changing so rapidly? When you put these two side by side, the comparison is really telling. I mean, look at this. During the daytime, both designs are excellent at creating shade and keeping things cool. Great. But the real difference maker is what happens at night. York's steep canyons, as we saw, are terrible at letting go of heat. They just trap it. Bologna's design, on the other hand, with that open central street and the covered walkways on the side, is way better at releasing that heat. It might seem like a small detail, but it has huge implications when we think about future resilience. So what this all suggests is that Bologna's model just seems to strike a more flexible, a more balanced pose. You still get all that great shelter for pedestrians, but the street itself can still breathe, you know? It can cool off properly at night. And that really suggests it might just be the more resilient design for the warming planet we're all living on. Okay, let's jump right in. We're talking about one of the most stunning boulevards in all of Europe, Vienna's Ringstrasse. You probably know it as this incredible symbol of imperial power, but it's got a pretty wild modern story. It turns out it's both a major solution to the city's climate problems and one of its biggest headaches. It's this amazing paradox of history and urban planning and, well, a vision for the future. So that really brings us to the core question here. How can something so glorious, a city's literal crown jewel, also be a huge climate challenge? It's this fascinating puzzle, and watching Vienna try to solve it right now, well, it's got lessons for cities just about everywhere. To really get your head around this, we have to rewind the clock, because this grand boulevard wasn't just built out of thin air. No, it literally rose from the rubble of the old medieval walls that used to wrap around the entire city. For hundreds of years, Vienna was defined by these massive fortifications. They were the city's boundary. But, by the mid-1800s, things like modern cannons made these giant walls pretty much useless. So, in 1857, the emperor made a huge decision, and by the end of the century, the Ringstrasse was in its prime, a totally new vision for Vienna. And this whole incredible transformation, it basically happened because one guy said so. Emperor Franz Joseph I just declared, "It is my will." That was it. With those three little words, he ordered the walls to be torn down, along with the huge empty fields around them, paving the way for something nobody had ever really seen before. So what was the whole point of this massive undertaking? Well, the Ringstrasse was meant to be a giant showcase for the Habsburg Empire. We're talking 5.3 kilometers long, 57 meters wide, and they lined it with these jaw-dropping buildings. The opera, the museums, the parliament. It was all about projecting power. Of course, some historians will tell you the wide streets also made it harder for revolutionaries to build barricades, but yeah, mostly it was about imperial bragging rights. But this is where the story gets really interesting. That 19th century design decision, it's had a massive and completely unforeseen effect on 21st century Vienna. It's created this unique environmental puzzle. And it all boils down to this fantastic German word, Frischluftschneise. It literally translates to a fresh air corridor. The best way to think about it is like a lung for the city. It's a channel that lets cool, fresh air flow in and move around. So here's the crazy part. The Ringstrasse's design, completely by accident, created one of these vital air corridors. Vienna is right next to these huge forests, the Vienna woods, that are constantly pumping out cool, fresh air. The boulevard is so wide that it acts like a giant funnel, channeling that good air right into the dense, hot city center. And boom, here it is. This is the paradox in black and white. On one hand, you've got the Siri. The Ringstrasse is this perfect fresh air corridor, pushing cool air into the city. Awesome, right? But then you look at the reality, what modern thermal cameras show us, and it's a distinct hotspot. It's become a canyon of asphalt and stone that just soaks up the sun's heat all day and radiates it back out.
So the very thing that's supposed to cool the city is also cooking it.
So what on earth do you do when your solution is also your problem? Especially when it's a world-famous historical site you can't just tear down. Well, Vienna is tackling this head-on. They're rolling out some incredibly clever strategies to solve this puzzle, trying to balance preserving history with adapting for the future.
And they're not just trying one thing. They've got a whole toolkit. We're talking about unsealing the ground, which is a huge deal on a historic boulevard, by ripping up asphalt and putting in special paving and grass. They're installing misting sprays for instant cooling, encouraging green walls on buildings, and this one's a biggie, they're actually reducing traffic lanes to cut down on all the waste heat from cars. And then extra space, it's being given back to people on bikes and on foot, which, as you can imagine, has sparked a whole new conversation about what this boulevard is even for anymore. At the end of the day, all of these green ideas are really about one simple thing: getting the natural water cycle to start working again in the middle of the city. If you let rainwater soak into the ground, the soil and the plants can do what they do best: cool the air around them. It's basically a simple, nature-based solution for a very modern problem. And this isn't just wishful thinking. The impact is real. Computer models show that all these green changes could reduce the number of super hot days, we're talking over 30 degrees Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit, by up to 12%. That is a huge, tangible difference for everyone who lives and works downtown. So what all this adds up to is a completely new identity for this legendary place. This whole project is about so much more than just making things cooler. It's about fundamentally rethinking the entire purpose of the promenade for the world we live in now.
This really says it all, doesn't it? On the left, you've got the Ringstrasse then, the Imperial Promenade. It was designed for showing off in your horse-drawn carriage, a big, bold symbol of the empire. And on the right, you see it now, becoming a climate-resilient promenade. It's being optimized for people, for comfort, for cooling. It's going from a monument of the past to a model for the future.
You ever walk through a city and wonder about the stories behind its parks? You know, sometimes the most peaceful places have the most violent beginnings. We're going to take a look at how ancient walls built for war can actually be reborn as a city's greatest asset for life and for health.
And it's a question that has a really fascinating answer. We're going to find that answer in Krakow, Poland, where a whole ring of medieval walls was transformed into a circle of life-giving green space.
So, to really get what makes this park in Krakow so special, we first need to look at a pretty famous comparison. See, after the age of walled cities, a lot of European towns had to figure out what to do with all that empty land where their fortifications used to be. And Vienna and Krakow, well, they took two totally different paths.
And right here, you see this massive difference in thinking. Vienna built the Ringstrasse, a grand boulevard, a road lined with trees, all about showing off imperial might. But Krakow created the Plenty, a park that roads cross through. Believe me, that tiny little distinction, it makes a world of difference.
Okay, so let's zoom in on what Krakow did. I mean, this isn't just any old park. It's a 4-kilometer-long green moat that completely wraps around the historic Old Town. And its story is, well, it's just a masterpiece of urban reinvention.
And this transition, this is the key moment in the whole story. For centuries, you had these massive walls protecting the city. But by the early 1800s, under Austrian rule, they were just crumbling and were set to be demolished. Now, that land could have just been sold off for a bunch of chaotic development. But no, a senator, this guy Felix Radwanski, he pushed for this totally radical idea: turn the entire space into a public garden.
And the sheer scale of this vision, I mean, it is just breathtaking. We are talking about 21 hectares of continuous parkland. That is a massive, unbroken loop of nature smack dab in the middle of the city. And the effect? Wow, it is absolutely stunning. The entire medieval core, with all its dense buildings and cobblestone streets, is basically left floating in a protective sea of green. It is such a unique and powerful design. You really won't find anything else quite like it in Europe. But, you know, the Plenty is way more than just a pretty face. Here in the 21st century, we're finding out it has these incredible hidden superpowers that are absolutely critical for the city's survival and its well-being. Let's break them down. Okay, first up, its ecological superpowers. See, Krakow has a pretty serious smog problem, but the park's mature trees act like a biological shield. their leaves literally trapping harmful pollutants. It's also a vital corridor for birds and insects, basically a highway for biodiversity cutting right through the concrete jungle. And just like an old medieval moat, it defends the old town, only this time from flooding, with its root systems soaking up huge amounts of stormwater. All right, then you've got the social superpowers. The park can go to escape the density of the city. Think about it. The old walls were built to keep people out. The park brings people together. It's a major commuter route for pedestrians, and it's a proven boost for the mental well-being of everyone who lives and works there. So you have to ask, how does a transformation this radical even happen? The story of the Planty isn't just some historical accident. Well, it turns out it perfectly illustrates this really powerful theory about how all sorts of systems, even entire cities, evolve, collapse, and then renew themselves. And here's the crazy irony of the whole thing. It's the rigid, unbending nature of those military walls that actually made the park possible. Because they prevented any messy, piecemeal development for centuries, the walls essentially held that land in trust, preserving a perfect continuous ring for a completely new purpose.
You know, this whole process, this cycle of collapse and creative rebirth, it actually has a name. It's called panarchy. It's a big idea from resilience theory that describes this continuous cycle where systems grow, they become stable, they face a crisis or a release, and then they reorganize into something totally new.
And you can see the cycle just perfectly in this story. So first, you have the medieval walls. That's the long, stable conservation phase. Then, tearing them down. That's the release, which freed up all that land. And finally, the creation of Planty Park, that is the organization, a new creative system built right from the remnants of the old one.
But here's the thing about the panarchy cycle. It never actually stops. Right now, today, the park is entering a new phase of reorganization, and it's being called on to fight a new kind of war against a very different kind of enemy. So, the park's fundamental job is literally changing right before our eyes. What was originally created in the 19th century as just a beautiful, ornamental space for a nice stroll, well, it's now being retasked as essential, functional climate adaptation machinery. I mean, look at this. The evolution is just crystal clear. Back then, trees were just for decoration. Today, they're critical pollution filters. The ground used to be for a pleasant walk. Now it's a bioswell for flood control. The entire purpose of this ring has shifted from defending against human armies to defending against climate change itself. And that, right there, is the heart of this whole story. The city's main defense system didn't just disappear, it evolved. It now protects its citizens not from cannonballs and invaders, but from things like air pollution, flash floods, and ecological collapse.
You know, when you picture Venice, your mind immediately goes to water, right? The canals, the lagoon, the gondolas, it's everywhere. But what if I told you that hidden right beneath the city's famous squares is a forgotten piece of technology, an ancient system for fresh water that might just hold the key to some of its biggest modern-day problem?
It sounds completely backward, doesn't it? How can a city literally built on water be at risk from both flooding and drought at the same time? Well, that's the strange paradox facing Venice today, and it's a serious one. So the city is fighting a war on two fronts. From below, you've got the famous Acqua Alta, those seasonal high tides and storm surges that put St. Mark's Square underwater. But at the exact same time, there's a threat from above. The modern aqueduct that pipes in all of Venice's drinking water, it's fed by rivers on the mainland that are now facing serious droughts. It's a real vulnerability. To find a way out of this mess, we actually have to look to the past. And the answer is hiding in plain sight, right under the feet of millions of tourists. You see those beautiful, iconic stone wellheads in pretty much every Venetian square? Well, they are not what you think they are. I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. For over 1,000 years, this major world power thrived while being completely surrounded by salt water. They had no rivers, no natural springs, and the groundwater was salty. So where on earth did they get their drinking water? Their solution was nothing short of genius. Okay, so here's the secret. That wellhead, the Vera da Pazzo, isn't a well. It doesn't go down into the groundwater. It's actually just the beautiful top piece, the access point, for an incredibly sophisticated cistern system buried right underneath the square itself. And this system, this network of cisterns, basically turned the entire city into a giant living sponge. It was a brilliant piece of low-tech engineering designed to do one thing and one thing only: capture every single precious drop of rainwater that fell from the sky.
And we're not talking about just a few of these things. No, no. This was a massive, decentralized network. At its peak, there were over 6,000 of these rainwater harvesting systems built under public squares and private courtyards all across the city. So how did this amazing rainwater machine work? Well, its beauty was in its simplicity. First, the square itself was sloped just right to act like a giant funnel, directing all the rainwater into stone catch basins. Below ground, a super thick layer of impermeable clay sealed the whole thing off, keeping salt water out. Then, the reservoir was filled with sand, which acted as a perfect natural filter, purifying the water as it seeped down into a central shaft. From there, you just drew it up through the wellhead. Simple, elegant, and effective.
And get this, it worked. It worked incredibly well. By the 1800s, this system was providing about 10.7 liters of fresh water per person every single day. It made Venice completely self-sufficient. And there were strict laws against polluting the squares, because everyone understood that's where their drinking water came from.
So, if the system was so brilliant, so sustainable, why did it disappear?
Well, in the late 19th century, progress arrived. Modern technology came knocking, and with it, a decision that would have consequences nobody could have predicted.
So, for about 1,000 years, the cisterns were the absolute lifeblood of the city. But then, 1884 happens. A brand new, modern aqueduct is built, piping in what seemed like an endless supply of fresh water all the way from the mainland. Almost overnight, the ancient system was seen as obsolete, unhygienic, old-fashioned, and so they decommissioned them. Thousands of these cisterns were abandoned. The beautiful wellheads were sealed up or just turned into flower pots, and the catch basins were paved right over. That deep, essential connection between the people and their water source was just gone.
And that decision had a side effect they probably never saw coming. By sealing off the city's ability to absorb water, they broke their own sponge. Now, when it rains hard, all that water has nowhere to go but straight into the canals, which just adds to the volume and makes the flooding during storms even worse.
But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because now, facing the realities of climate change, experts are taking a second look at this obsolete technology. They're seeing this ancient system not as a relic, but as a potential blueprint for a more resilient future. The potential here is just staggering. If you add it all up, the historic water retention capacity of this entire network was around 450,000 cubic meters. That's a massive strategic water reserve just sitting there, dormant, right under the city. You know, all the headlines today are about the Moose project, these giant, high-tech, electricity-guzzling sea barriers. And they're impressive, for sure. But the cistern system represents a totally different philosophy. It's low-tech, it's passive, it's spread out all over the city, and best of all, it requires zero electricity to work. So, what could we actually do with them today? Well, the ideas being floated are incredibly smart. Bringing them back online would immediately help reduce storm flooding by giving the rainwater somewhere to go. It creates a backup water supply in case the aqueducts fails, and you could use that water for non-drinking needs, like washing the streets or fighting fires, which takes a huge strain off the modern system.
Okay, so take a look at this. On one side, you've got this beautiful, bustling medieval waterway. I mean, it's the heart of the city, right? And on the other side, well, that's what we replaced it with in the 20th century. We called it progress. We paved over history to make room for the car. But here's the question. Was it really progress? Or was it actually a huge, huge mistake?
For hundreds of years, these canals were basically the freeways of Europe. They made cities like Ghent and Bruges incredibly rich from all the trade. But then came the train and the car. And suddenly, these amazing waterways started to look, well, kind of old-fashioned. People thought they were just dirty obstacles getting in the way of the future.
And this right here, this is what's so fascinating. The mindset at the time. They didn't see filling in a river as destroying something. No. It was a sanitary improvement. It was modern. The whole idea was, just hide the water, tame nature, slap some concrete on it, and call it a day. But man, was that thinking flawed.
So what happens when you do that? You create what experts now call brittle systems. It's like this. Imagine a concrete pipe. It's super efficient, right, for a normal day. But what happens when you get a massive storm, the kind we're seeing all the time now? That rigid, brittle pipe just can't handle it. It's overwhelmed, it fails catastrophically, and boom, the whole city floods. And that brings us to our first big case study, the city of Ghent in Belgium. Talk about a perfect example. They made this exact mistake.
and then they spent years and a whole lot of money trying to fix it. They literally decided to bring a river back from the dead.
I mean, look at the life cycle of this waterway. Back in the day, it's a super important trade highway. Fast forward to the 1960s, and it's a parking lot. A parking lot! But the reason they brought it back, this is key, it wasn't just to make the city look nice for tourists. The city literally had to do it. It was, as they put it, hard hydraulic necessity. They needed that river to survive the future.
And this is where it gets almost comical if it weren't so serious. The entire reason the city of Ghent was founded in the first place, the spot where two rivers meet, was buried under concrete. They basically created a giant plug in their own city's plumbing. It's like putting a cork in your bathtub drain and then being shocked when it overflows. In fixing this mistake, wow, it was a massive undertaking. Just to give you an idea of the scale we're talking about, similar projects to this one have dredged up over 1 million cubic meters of gunk. 1 million! To put that in perspective, that's like filling 400 Olympic swimming pools with mud. All that work just to undo one really bad decision.
Okay, so that was Ghent. Now let's hop over to the city right next door, Bruges. And Bruges is fascinating because it's kind of our control group in this whole story. You know what they did with their canals? Something totally radical. Absolutely nothing. They just left them alone. And the results? They're pretty incredible.
So now we have the actual science to back up what those medieval builders just seemed to know by instinct. Get this, during a heat wave, the streets right next to the canals in Bruges are a full 1 to 3 degrees Celsius cooler. That's a huge difference. The canals are basically a natural citywide air conditioner.
And it's not just about the cooling. The benefits are stacked, one on top of the other. This blue network creates these cooling corridors that stretch like 100 meters out from the banks. They're also ecological corridors, letting animals and birds move through the city. They even manage the old quay walls to be like vertical gardens for insects and birds. It's not just water, it's a whole living system, baked right into the city itself.
Okay, so what's the big takeaway from all this? Because it's about more than just water, right? What we're starting to see is this much bigger, kind of weird idea that explains why these old cities are so genius. It's something called the paradox of constraints.
And here it is. This is the big aha moment. The whole theory is that the stuff that limited the people who built these cities, things like having to build a giant wall around everything or not having cars, those limitations actually forced them to be brilliant. They were forced to build cities that, as it turns out, are super sustainable and resilient. Their biggest problems accidentally became their greatest strengths. This table really spells it out. Think about it. They had defensive walls, so they couldn't just build outwards forever. They had to build up, densely. We now call that low carbon density. They had to walk everywhere, so they built everything close together. We call that walkability. They had to use the water that was right there, so they figured out how to manage it. We call that flood resilience. They were solving our modern problems centuries ago, and they didn't even know it.
So where does this leave us? The big lesson here is that this isn't just a cool history fact. It's a real, practical blueprint. It's a guide for how we can build the smarter, stronger cities we really, really need right now. So the next time you see a picture of a city like Bruges, don't just think of it as a pretty postcard. Those winding streets, those canals, they're not just for tourists. They are hardworking pieces of infrastructure. They're an active, functional part of the city, and honestly, they're often doing a better job of managing things like heat and water than our brand new modern designs.
And this quote just nails it. Today, one of the most cutting-edge ideas in urban planning is the sponge city. This idea of designing cities to absorb rainwater naturally. But here's the kicker. The medieval city was already a sponge city. They just didn't have a cool name for it. They were, completely by accident, centuries ahead of their time.
So why do we love the winding streets of an old city? Well, today we're going to dig into the science behind that feeling. And it's a fascinating story that connects modern neuroscience with some of our deepest, oldest instincts. I bet you've felt this before. That sense of delight when you're just wandering, kind of lost in the lanes of a city like Siena or Prague. And it turns out, it's not just about the pretty buildings. It's about how our brains are fundamentally wired to experience a space. To really get this, we have to go way back. I mean, way back in our evolutionary history. Back to a time when humans were both hunters and the hunted. And our survival literally depended on the landscape around us. And that brings us to this really key idea, prospect refuge theory. A geographer named J. Appleton figured out that we are hardwired to seek out places where we can see what's going on without being seen ourselves. You know, picture a lookout point that's sheltered by rocks. That mix of a great view and a safe hiding spot, that's the absolute sweet spot for our survival brain. So, how does this actually play out in a city? Well, take a medieval street. It's narrow, the buildings create a sense of enclosure that gives you a huge sense of refuge, of safety. But it doesn't feel suffocating because the view, the prospect, unfolds little by little as you walk. Now contrast that with a huge, wide-open modern plaza. That gives you all the prospect in the world, but zero refuge. And that's exactly why those spaces can leave us feeling a little anxious, totally exposed. And there's actually a name for this whole slowly revealed view thing. It's called serial vision. A curved street is the absolute master of this. You feel safely enclosed, but that curve up ahead, it promises something new, right? A little mystery to solve. It just pulls you forward, making you want to explore. It's the perfect balance of prospect and refuge in motion. Okay, so our survival instincts are one huge piece of the puzzle. But there's another layer here, a deeper one. It's about what's literally happening inside our brains when we look at these old streets. Because it turns out our minds actually crave a very specific kind of complexity. And that secret ingredient, it's something called fractal complexity. Our brains have evolved over millennia to be incredibly efficient at processing fractal patterns. These are the complex, self-repeating patterns you see everywhere in nature, like in a fern, a coastline, or a snowflake. And get this, a medieval building is basically one giant fractal. It has interesting details at every single scale. You've got the big picture, the overall shape against the sky. Then you get a little closer, you see the rhythm of the windows. Closer still, you see the texture of the stone itself. And then you can get right up to it and see the grain in a wooden door. Your eye always has something to latch onto. And this is wild. It's not just that we like looking at this stuff. It has a real physiological effect on us. Studies have actually shown that when we look at these complex fractal patterns, our brain processes them with very little effort. And that, in turn, significantly reduces our levels of cortisol, the stress hormone. So that visually messy old street is literally calming you down, while a huge blank modern wall can actually increase your stress. Now, beyond what we see, the design of these cities is completely shaped by how we move through them. And for most of human history, well, that meant one thing, walking.
And it all boils down to this one number, 5 kilometers per hour. The urbanist Jan Gehl calls this the human speed. It's the fundamental metric that shaped pretty much every city before the car.
See, at 5 kilometers an hour, you have time to absorb all these rich, fine-grained details. The handle on a door, the stuff in a shop window, the expressions on people's faces. It's designed for connection. But architecture designed for a car zipping by at 60 kilometers an hour? It has to be big, simple, monolithic, just to be understood at a glance. All that detail is irrelevant, and social contact is basically suppressed. This focus on the human scale has these profound consequences for the social life of a city. Because as Jan Gehl always says, life doesn't happen in buildings, it happens between them. That's where the good stuff is.
To get this, we need one last really cool biological term. It's called thigmotaxis. It's this instinct found in all sorts of creatures, from insects to us, to stick to the edges of a space. Just think about it. When you walk into an empty public square, you don't just stand in the middle, right? You naturally drift towards the walls, the steps, the cafe tables along the edge. We're edge dwellers.
And medieval streets are the absolute masters of creating these sticky edges. They're jam-packed with frequent doorways, little recesses to pause in, covered arcades for shelter. All this stuff creates a porous, lively...
In contrast, so much of modern design creates what you'd call hard edges. You know exactly what I mean. Long, blank walls or featureless glass facades. They give us nowhere to pause and nothing to engage with. They actively repel us, leaving those spaces feeling sterile and lifeless.
So when you put it all together, the prospect refuge theory, our brain's love for fractal complexity and our body's need for these human-scaled, sticky spaces, you get a really powerful conclusion. Our love for old cities isn't just some sentimental nostalgia for the past. It's a deep, biological response to an environment that is perfectly aligned with the needs of our minds and our bodies.
So we hear it all the time, right? This idea that we're living through a loneliness epidemic. But what if the solution isn't some new app or self-help book? What if it's something much, much older?
we're going to dig into the fascinating idea that the very layout of ancient cities might just hold the cure for our modern sense of disconnection. I know it sounds a little wild. Could the answer to feeling isolated in the 21st century really be hiding in the Middle Ages? But that's exactly what we're going to explore. This idea that the very structure of a medieval town, maybe not even on purpose, was built to make us feel connected. And the answer has some pretty huge implications for how we build our cities today. And this quote right here is the heart of it. A spatial antidepressant. Just let that sink in for a second. The idea that the physical space around us, the streets, the squares, the buildings, can literally be engineered to fight off loneliness, simply by forcing us to see and interact with each other. Okay, so how did they actually do it? Well, the first clue is all about a very specific number. You can think of it as a kind of blueprint for the perfect human-sized community. This brings us to a really important idea from anthropology, Dunbar's number. At its core, it's the theory that our brains just aren't wired to handle an infinite number of friends. There's a real cognitive limit to how many stable relationships we can truly maintain at one time. And that magic number? It's right around 150. That seems to be the natural size for a human tribe, a small village, a tight-knit group. It's the scale where you can know other people, and this is the really crucial part, where you can be known by them. And what's so cool is that medieval cities basically stumbled into this sweet spot by accident. They weren't built on massive anonymous grids. They were all about clusters. You had houses packed around a shared courtyard, or neighborhoods built around the local church, or communities formed around the common well. You were naturally living alongside, guess what, about 150 other people. It turned abstract density into a real, recognizable community. So, if the physical city, the streets and buildings, is the hardware, what about the software that actually runs on it? This is where the idea gets really powerful. This hardware-software analogy is the key to the whole thing. The hardware is the physical stuff, right? The bricks and mortar. But the software, that's what we call social capital. It's the trust, the networks, the neighborliness that makes a community actually work. Here's the thing though, social capital doesn't just appear out of thin air. You have to build it, it has to be generated. And the central claim here is that the physical environment, the city's hardware, is the engine that generates it. But is there any actual proof? Oh, you bet there is. And we're gonna look at some amazing evidence from a major study done in Galway, Ireland. Galway was the perfect real-world laboratory because it has both a dense, walkable medieval core and these sprawling, modern, car-dependent suburbs right next to each other. The results were, to use the researchers' own words, statistically profound. That's science talk for, holy cow, look at this. People in the old, walkable neighborhood were way more likely to know their neighbors, trust other people in general, and even get involved in local politics. The data is just crystal clear. How you build a neighborhood directly shapes the trust within it. So why does this happen? Well, it all comes down to something sociologists call weak ties. These aren't your best friends. These are the small, unplanned, low-stakes chats you have, bumping into someone at the grocery store, nodding to the person you see every morning walking their dog. These little moments seem insignificant, but they're the threads that actually weave the entire fabric of a community together. Which brings us to the villain of our story. If the medieval town is designed to connect people, what's the great disconnector of modern life? Well, according to the research, it's the automobile. It acts like a solvent on social cohesion. It just dissolves the bonds between us. And the numbers totally back this up. In European cities, the difference is stark. In the traditional city centers, car dependency is down around 18 to 21%. But once you get out to the suburbs, it jumps way up to 33 to 38%. That's a massive shift away from that walkable world that's so good at creating those weak ties. And the hidden costs are just insane. A moving car eats up a huge amount of public space. And get this, your car spends 97% of its time parked, just sitting there. All that parking creates these huge dead zones that push buildings and people further and further apart. A medieval street plan just doesn't have room for any of that. So what you get are two completely different models for how we interact. In a walkable town, your social life is accidental, it's public, it's easy, it's low friction, it just happens. In the suburbs, it's all planned and private.
It's high friction. You have to schedule a play date. You have to organize a barbecue. That spontaneous magic is just gone.
So, if the car creates this social void, how can we actively design for connection? The final piece of this puzzle comes from understanding something called good friction. Yeah, you heard me right, good friction. It's a concept from an amazing urbanist named William H. White, and he called it triangulation. The idea is pretty simple. It's when some third thing, an external stimulus, provides a link between people and gives strangers an excuse to talk to each other. Let me walk you through it. A street performer starts playing music, or you and a stranger are both looking at the weird vegetables at a farmer's market. Suddenly, you have a shared experience, a common focus. It gives you a reason to make eye contact, to smile, to say a quick word. And just like that, a weak tie is formed. Medieval cities were just jam-packed with these little points of triangulation. I mean, think about this. Even something as simple as a narrow street forces this tiny, polite, social dance. Oh, after you. No, I insist, after you. Modern design is obsessed with eliminating that kind of friction, with creating perfect, efficient flow. But in doing that, we might be eliminating the very social sparks that friction creates. Which brings us to our big conclusion, building our world on a human scale, with all its messy, inefficient, wonderful friction. It isn't just a matter of taste. It's not about nostalgia for the past. It is a fundamental requirement for creating the high-trust, connected society that I think we all desperately want. Let's talk about a surprisingly old solution to a very, very modern problem. You know the one I'm talking about. Why our town centers can feel like total ghost towns the minute the clock strikes 5. Well, the answer might just be hiding in plain sight, in an idea that's been working for centuries.
I mean, you've felt this, right? The shops pull their shutters down, the commuters all head home, and suddenly the heart of the city just feels hollow. It's a problem so many of us have noticed, but what's really causing it?
So let's start by putting a name to the problem. Urban planners actually have a term for this. They call it the hollow high street. And that brings us to this key idea, the donut effect. Seriously, picture a donut. The ring is the city center, bustling with shops and offices during the day. But the middle, the hole, that's where people should be living. When they all live somewhere else, you get that empty core at night. That's the hollowed out feeling right there. So how do we fill that donut hole? How do we fix the hollow high street? Well, you're not going to believe this, but maybe the most innovative solution is also one of the oldest. It's time for a quick lesson from the past. So let's zoom in on this one incredible place. It's called The Rose in Chester in the UK, and it's basically a living, breathing museum of a totally different way to build a city. A way that you'll notice doesn't have a donut effect problem. And this isn't some flash-in-the-pan experiment. No, this model has been working, adapting, and just plain thriving for 800 years. That is not a typo. In the world of urban planning, that kind of staying power is, well, it's pretty much unheard of. And don't think it's just some dusty old relic either. Today, right now, the Rose are home to over 200 shops, indie traders, cafes, you name it. It is still a vibrant, living, breathing heart of the city. So what was their secret? How did they pull this off? Well, it all boils down to one simple, but honestly genius concept, the vertical city. See, the basic building block back then was something called the burgage plot. So forget sprawling suburbs. I want you to imagine these long, narrow plots of land where a family's entire world, their home, their job, their storefront, was all stacked, one on top of the other, in a single building right on the main street. And here's the magic of how they stacked it. You've got the shop on the ground floor, right? That's your public face where you meet customers. Then, right above it, you've got the family's home. And then, up in the attic or out back, that's the workshop. That's where the stuff was actually made. It was the original live, work, create setup, all in one. And here's the payoff, the absolute key. Because you had people living, working, and shopping all in the same place, you had activity around the clock. You couldn't have ghost districts because the city never really shut down. The economy and daily life were just completely tangled up together. You know, this system also created this incredible financial safety net. Think about it. If the shop had a bad month, the family wasn't immediately at risk of losing their home. The whole building was one integrated unit. It made small businesses so much more resilient to the ups and downs of the market.
So that brings up a really big question, right? If this model was so darn successful, Why on earth did we stop doing it? Well, huge changes like the Industrial Revolution, and especially the invention of the car, created this whole new dream to separate our noisy, messy work lives from our quiet, peaceful home lives. And that idea gave us the modern city and all the rules that now make it so hard to go back.
And this really lays it out clearly. We went from stacking life vertically to spreading it out horizontally. We created these zones for everything: a zone for living, a zone for working, a zone for shopping. And in doing that, we created these fragile retail-only monocultures that they just die at 5 p.m. We traded resilient mixed-use communities for something much more brittle.
So, trying to bring this idea back today, yeah, it gets tricky. Modern rules and regulations are a big hurdle. You've got strict fire codes, which are really important, of course, but they're hard to apply to old buildings. Insurance companies often charge more for these mixed-use properties. And a separate front door for an apartment upstairs means less window space for the shop on the ground floor. It's a whole web of modern problem. But here's the really exciting part. Despite all those barriers, this 800-year-old idea is making a major comeback. Because, as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. Or maybe in this case, reinvention. Two massive problems are basically forcing our hand. First, we have a critical housing shortage pretty much everywhere. And at the exact same time, our main streets are fighting for their lives against online shopping. So all of a sudden, all that empty, unused space above the shops, it's starting to look like a golden opportunity.
And the benefits today are just so obvious. When you bring people back to live downtown, you're giving local shops built-in customers. You're creating this incredible social energy, and something urbanists call eyes on the street, which is just a natural, free security system. And, this is huge, you're reducing our carbon footprint by using the buildings we already have instead of building new ones. And I want to be clear, this isn't just some nice theory. It is actually happening. Ireland has a national policy called Town Centre First, designed to make this happen. And you have amazing projects in cities like York that are right now turning empty, dusty upper floors into beautiful, modern, low-carbon apartments. Okay, so let's tie all this together. What's it really going to take to build this new future by, kind of ironically, looking deep into our past? At its heart, the logic is just so simple and elegant. It's a perfect circle. People who live in the town center become the customers that local shops desperately need. And in return, those shops provide all the cool amenities and services that make the town center a great place to live in the first place. Everybody wins. Okay, so today we're going to tackle what might just be the biggest urban planning idea of this decade, the 15-minute city. You've probably heard of it. It's popping up everywhere, from Paris to Singapore. But here's a wild thought. What if this super modern, futuristic vision for our cities is actually a look back into our distant past? And that's the big, kind of provocative idea we're digging into today. The argument here is that this whole futuristic concept isn't really new at all. It's a rediscovery. It's a pretty bold claim, right? It suggests that to build the city of tomorrow, we might actually need to learn from the city of yesterday. I mean, that's a fascinating question, isn't it? So, does this wild idea actually hold any water? Well, to figure that out, we've got to first understand what the 15-minute city really is, before we can see how it stacks up against the cities of old. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this radically old idea. What are the core principles, these 4 pillars, that are supposed to hold up this whole vision for our cities? So, here's the basic concept. It was really championed by an urbanist named Carlos Moreno and made famous by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. It's all about putting life back within reach, making sure everything you need for a good life, your job, the grocery store, a park, the doctor, is just a short walk or a quick bike ride away. And this slide, wow, it just perfectly sums up the huge shift in thinking we're talking about. On the left, you've got that classic 20th century obsession, let's save time by building bigger highways so we can drive faster. But the idea on the right, what's called chrono-urbanism, it just flips that completely on its head. It says true wealth isn't about speed, it's about valuing our time by not having to travel so much in the first place. So how do you make this all work? Well, it really comes down to these 4 pillars. You need density, so there are enough people and services in one place. You need proximity, making sure those services are actually close. You need diversity, a good mix of homes, jobs, and shops. And finally, you need digitalization. That's the modern secret sauce for things like working from home. And this is where it gets really interesting and loops back to our main theme. You see, while digitalization is obviously a new thing, those other 3 pillars, density, proximity, and diversity, They were the absolute defining features of pretty much every successful city before the car came along. They are essentially deeply medieval. But look, this isn't just about getting your groceries faster. The real goal here is something the source calls social intensity. The idea is that when you bring people closer together, you just naturally create more opportunities for them to connect, to interact, to build that social fabric that makes a place actually feel like a community.
Okay, so that's the theory. But does any of this actually work in the real world? For that, let's take a trip to Ghent in Belgium. It's a perfect example of an ancient city that used its old bones to solve a very modern problem, the car. You see, by 2017, Ghent had this massive problem. Its gorgeous old medieval streets were just completely choked with cars. And then the city found out something pretty shocking. A full 40% of all that traffic wasn't even trying to go to the city center. People were just using it as a shortcut.
So what did they do? They came up with this absolutely brilliant plan. Picture the city like a pizza. They divided it into 6 slices around the center. You could drive into any slice you wanted from a ring road on the outside, but, and this is the genius part, you couldn't drive from one slice to another through the middle. You had to go back out to the ring road first.
And this is the real magic trick here. By blocking the cars that were just cutting through, they basically created a superhighway for people. All of a sudden, walking, biking, or taking the bus became the fastest and easiest way to get across the city.
And you know what? The results were, well, they were immediate and just incredible. Take a look at this. Car traffic in the center dropped by 20%. Cycling shot up by a whopping 25%, and even public transit got a nice little boost. The city just became quieter and safer, like overnight. Now, you can imagine a lot of shopkeepers were freaking out. They thought this would totally kill their business. But the exact opposite happened. The city center stopped being a shortcut and started being a place people actually wanted to go. Turns out, the number of new businesses and restaurants actually went up.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. Sure, that works for a quaint old European town, but no way that could work in a giant, sprawling megacity, right? Well, for that, let's head over to Singapore. The source has this amazing term for it, vertical medievalism, and it's such a perfect analogy. You know how a medieval merchant might have had his shop on the ground floor and lived right upstairs? Well, Singapore just takes that same exact logic and blows it up to a massive modern scale. I mean, look at this comparison. It's almost one-to-one. Instead of a workshop on the ground floor, now you've got an amazing food court. And then stacked right on top, just like the old living quarters, you have apartments, schools, clinics, everything. It's basically a whole walkable neighborhood in one giant building. And Singapore is really smart about how they do this. They use this kind of layered approach. So your absolute essentials, like a pharmacy or a little grocery store, are designed to be in a 5-minute cluster. Then the things you need less often, like a movie theater, are still within that bigger 15-minute radius. It's a really practical way to make it all work.
Okay, so let's tie all of this together. What we're really seeing is that it doesn't matter if it's a horizontal medieval city or a vertical megacity. The basic logic behind what makes a city great for people is surprisingly timeless.
And at the end of the day, this is the big takeaway, right? The 15-minute city isn't some pie-in-the-sky fantasy. It's actually a return to first principles. It's us rediscovering a proven, human-scale way of living that we kind of just threw away in the 20th century to make room for more cars.
And that's the core idea that connects a city like historic Ghent with a place like hyper-modern Singapore. These principles, having things close by and mixing different uses together, they're not tied to one time or one place. They're scale independent. They just work.
You know, we all love to travel, right? To see these absolutely beautiful, historic cities around the world. But what happens when those cities become victims of their own success? What happens when our love for a place starts to, well, hollow it out from the inside? That's the big question we're digging into here.
This quote right here, it just gets straight to the heart of the matter. It perfectly frames that central conflict, the tension between a living, breathing city where people build their actual lives and a perfectly preserved attraction designed for us, the temporary visitors. It really makes you think, at what point does a city cross that line from a living community to just a product?
So to really get into this, let's start with our first section and head to the poster child for this exact problem, Venice. We're going to take a look at the crisis of museification. What happens when a city becomes this beautiful, historic, but ultimately empty shell?
So what exactly is museumification?
Well, think of it as the process where the soul of a city gets kind of scooped out, leaving behind this perfectly preserved body. Imagine a place where the ancient buildings look amazing. The canals are gorgeous, but all the local bakeries, the hardware stores, the schools, they're gone, replaced by souvenir shops and tourist traps. The city looks authentic, but its living culture has vanished.
And Venice? Well, Venice is the ultimate warning sign. It is the canary in the coal mine. Its unique, human-scale design, which is so perfect for walking, also makes it incredibly fragile. It just wasn't built to handle the sheer pressure of modern global tourism. We're talking a staggering 30 million visitors a year before the pandemic. Just think about that.
The scale of the change here is just astounding. I mean, look at these numbers. The population of the historic center has absolutely plummeted from 175,000 down to under 50,000. The source material doesn't just call this a decline, it calls it an evacuation. People are being forced out.
And this visual right here perfectly captures the economic engine that's driving that whole evacuation. The tourist market is just too powerful. A landlord can make the same amount of money from tourists in a single week that they can from a long-term resident in an entire month. The math is simple, but the reality is brutal. How can a local family possibly compete with that?
But being priced out is only half the story. As we're about to see in our next section, the problem is also deeply psychological. This leads us to this feeling of unhoming, and for that, we're going to look at the symbolic displacement happening in Tallinn. So let's talk about this concept of unhoming. This is what happens even when people aren't physically kicked out. It's that jarring, alienating feeling when the very fabric of your neighborhood changes so much that it just doesn't feel like yours anymore. You still live there, sure, but you've become a stranger in your own home.
And here you can see these two conflicting stories at play. On one side, you've got the resident story, a story of community, of shared history, and on the other, you have this new narrative that tourism brings in, one that's all about consuming heritage and chasing trendy vibes. These two worlds collide, and the original residents start to feel like their own identity is being erased.
Okay, so we've seen the economic and psychological costs, but it's not all doom and gloom. Some cities are choosing not to be passive victims, and that brings us to our third section, where we'll see how Dubrovnik decided to fight back. Dubrovnik was facing overwhelming crowds, especially from cruise ships, so they launched this Respect the City initiative. Think of it like a strategic playbook for taking back control. And it wasn't just some marketing campaign. It was a concrete, technology-driven plan. They started monitoring crowd levels in real time, actually restricting access when the city hit its limit. And they started working with cruise lines to stagger arrivals.
And they were absolutely serious about it. They made the incredibly bold decision to cut the maximum number of people allowed inside the historic walls at any one time in half, slashing it from 8,000 down to just 4,000. That's a really decisive move that prioritizes the health of the city over just maximizing visitor number.
So, did it work? Well, the data says yes. A big yes. Dubrovnik's global sustainable tourism score jumped significantly, from 70% all the way up to 86%. This is really powerful proof that with the right strategy and, frankly, the political will, cities are not helpless. They can actively manage the flow of tourism. This brings us to our final section, and a really crucial question. Dubrovnik's success is for sure a glimmer of hope, but is managing the symptoms the same as actually curing the disease?
What this really shows us is that active management works. Technology and a smart strategy can be powerful tools to defend a historic city, to push back against the worst excesses of over-tourism, and to restore some sense of balance for the people who actually live there.
Today, we're diving into this massive modern-day battle that's happening all across Europe to save historic city centers. And look, this isn't just about preserving a bunch of old stones. It's a real fight to bring the very soul of these ancient places back to life.
So let's start with a question that's become, well, way more urgent than you might think for towns all over the continent. I mean, what really happens when the local shops start to close down? When residents move away and those beautiful upper floors just go dark and silent? What's actually lost?
Well, it turns out the decline is being treated as a full-blown national crisis. See, these historic centers aren't just pretty postcards. They're actually powerful engines for both cultural identity and the economy. So when they start to fail, yeah, the whole nation really feels it.
Okay, so how do you even begin to solve a problem on that scale? First, we're going to look at what's happening in France, where they've launched this huge state-led intervention. The government basically decided to step in and fix this systematically from the top down.
And when I say huge, I mean it. The scale here is just staggering. France is pouring $5 billion into a program they call Action Cœur de Ville, which basically translates to Action for the Heart of the City. It kicked off in 2018, and its mission is to breathe life back into the cores of 222 different cities. And this is not just about slapping on a new coat of paint. The whole program is really holistic. It attacks the problem from 5 different angles all at once. You've got housing, the local economy, mobility, heritage, and making sure people have access to public services. It's the whole shebang.
This quote really gets to the heart of their philosophy. It's this big admission that, just restoring some beautiful old storefronts is not going to cut it. If you want any of this to actually stick, you have to build a living, breathing economy behind those pretty facades.
So what does this actually look like in practice? Let's get concrete and zoom in on one city, Cahors. It's a perfect case study for how this Action for the Heart of the City program really works on the ground. In Cahors, they had this really clear people-first process. First thing they did, they focused on renovating those historic buildings to fight vacancy and, actually create homes for people. Second, they pedestrianized the street, making it a place for humans, not just for cars. And this is the crucial part. They actually got the residents involved in the design process right from the very beginning.
And this is where the strategy gets really smart. The government is directly paying property owners, giving them incentives to bring those empty, abandoned upper floors back to life as modern apartments. They're basically subsidizing the incredibly complex work of turning a medieval structure into a place people can actually live today. And in doing so, they're recreating that vibrant, mixed-use feel of the past.
So, the big question, is any of this actually working? Well, look, it's not an overnight miracle fix, but the data shows real, tangible progress. In a lot of these 22 towns, the bleeding has stopped. Vacancy rates are leveling off, and that decades-long exodus to the suburbs, it's finally starting to slow down. Okay, let's hop over to Italy now and check out a completely different approach in the city of Bologna. This isn't a top-down national plan. No, this is a revival that's all about protecting and leaning into the city's one-of-a-kind identity. See, Bologna's identity is completely tied up with its university, which happens to be the oldest in the entire Western world, founded way back in 1088. This constant river of students flowing into the city keeps it young. It creates demand for things like cheap housing and nightlife, which is exactly what stops it from becoming a beautiful but sterile museum, kind of like Venice.
But here's the problem. The rise of platforms like Airbnb has created this direct conflict, a real battle for the city's soul. Landlords can often make way more money renting to tourists for a weekend than to a student for a semester. And that pits the needs of tourists directly against the needs of the students, who are the city's living, breathing backbone.
Bologna's answer to this challenge came from this really innovative EU project called ROCK, and its goal was crystal clear: use the city's incredible cultural heritage as an engine for sustainable, long-term regeneration, not just for short-term tourist dollars.
So this strategy wasn't just about preserving buildings. It was about making the city's unique heritage actually work for everyone who lives there right now. We're talking about practical stuff, like making these ancient medieval streets accessible for people with disabilities, and using the city's famous covered walkways, the porticos, as these vibrant public spaces for people to meet and exchange ideas.
And all of this leads to a really key strategic shift. Bologna is using its deep intellectual history to rebrand itself. They want to be known as a city of knowledge, not just another city of art. The idea is to attract long-term talent. We're talking researchers, innovators, creatives, not just tourists who are here for a couple of days.
So after looking at these two very different models of urban revival, what's the big takeaway here? We've seen this massive, nationwide economic approach on one hand, and a super specific, identity-focused approach on the other. What does that tell us about how to save these incredible historic places?
When you put them side by side, the contrast is pretty stark, right? The French model is all about national funding and massive scale, tackling economics and housing across 222 different cities. Bologna's approach is way more surgical. It's an EU-funded project that's laser-focused on rebranding a single city's unique identity.
Okay, what if the best roadmap for surviving the 21st century wasn't dreamed up in some tech lab, but was actually perfected like hundreds of years ago in the Middle Ages? I know, it sounds kind of crazy, right? But the key to solving our biggest modern problems, from climate change to just feeling so disconnected, it might be hiding in plain sight on the cobblestone streets of our oldest cities. So let's dig into this fascinating idea together.
All right, I want you to just picture two different places in your mind. First, imagine you're standing in an old medieval town square. You can almost feel the buzz, right? The sense of connection, everything built to a scale that just feels comfortable. It feels good. Now, let's completely switch gears. Picture a huge, sprawling, modernist parking lot. That feeling changes, doesn't it? All of a sudden, it's isolating. It feels inhuman. And for a lot of us, it kind of sparks this low-level anxiety.
And that really gets to the core question we're tackling here. Why is that? Why does some places make us feel safe and connected, while others just leave us feeling kind of anxious and alone? And I promise you, it's not just a matter of personal taste. There is a deep, scientific reason for this, and it has massive implications for our happiness and honestly, for the future of our communities.
So yeah, that feeling of wrongness you get in certain places, it is not just in your head. It's actually a symptom of a much, much bigger problem. And it's directly tied to the major crises we are all facing right now in the 21st century.
Think about it. The way we've designed our modern world, the very blueprint for our cities and suburbs, is actively making our biggest challenges worse. We're talking climate change, which is supercharged by our total dependency on cars. We're talking about a literal epidemic of social isolation, and we're talking about a kind of fragile economic instability. The way we've built our world is, in many ways, creating the very problems we're now so desperately trying to solve.
So, if the modern blueprint is failing us, where do we even begin to look for a better one? Well, the answer is powerful, and it's probably not what you'd expect. It's something called the Neo-Medieval Roadmap.
Now, when we say neo-medieval, let's be super clear. We are not talking about building moats and castles. Not at all. What we're talking about is taking 4 timeless principles from these old cities and applying them to our world today. Those are density, so more people and services in a smaller footprint; mixed use, where you can live, work, and shop all in the same neighborhood; walkability, which is a big one; and a real focus on human-scale architecture.
And this right here is probably the most important piece of the puzzle. Building things to a human scale isn't just a charming design choice or some kind of quaint nostalgia. The science is showing us it's a biological necessity. I mean, for thousands and thousands of years, our brains evolved in environments that were built for walking, for seeing other faces. We are quite literally hardwired to feel good and to thrive in places that are built for us, not for our cars.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. This isn't just a nice theory. The idea that these older ways of building are just fundamentally better for us is backed by hard science from a bunch of different fields. So let's actually look at the proof. Let's start with our brains. It turns out they're pretty predictable. Our brains love old town squares because they offer 2 key things: prospect, which means clear lines of sight, and refuge, which are places to feel safe and protected, like under an awning. They're also full of something called fractals. These are the complex repeating patterns you see in nature, like a leaf or a coastline. Our brains find these patterns incredibly calming. That giant empty parking lot, it offers none of that.
Then you've got this sociological proof. A study out of Galway, Ireland came up with this incredible insight. Walking is inefficient if you're just trying to get from A to B as fast as possible. But that very inefficiency, the slowing down, the random encounters, bumping into a neighbor at the corner store, that's what creates what they call the efficiency of social trust. It's how we weave a community together, one little unplanned conversation at a time.
A great way to think of it is that a good street acts like a social condenser. It's not just a path to get somewhere, it's a machine for human connection. It concentrates all those little interactions and relationships. And that is the total opposite of a sprawling suburb, where the whole design is meant to minimize those kinds of spontaneous social collisions.
And then, believe it or not, there's the financial proof. This is so fascinating. You've got 2 famous historic cities. On one hand, you have Venice, which has largely sold itself out to this extraction model of mass tourism, where value is just pulled out of the city for outside investors. On the other hand, you have Ghent in Belgium, which made a conscious choice to prioritize the quality of life for its actual residents. The result? Well, the data is crystal clear. Ghent's model of investing in its own community creates way more sustainable, long-term value.
Okay, so at this point you might be thinking, all right, so we should just make all our new buildings look old? And the answer is a definite no. This isn't about creating some kind of historical theme park or just a pretty facade. It's about getting serious, and I mean really serious with policy.
Because to actually bring these human-scale principles into the real world, you can't just cross your fingers and hope for the best. It takes a really rigorous and coherent policy framework. It means city leaders have to make intentional, structured, and sometimes really difficult decisions that put people ahead of cars and long-term value ahead of short-term profit.
So what does that policy actually look like? Well, it boils down to 3 huge moves. First, you have to curb predatory tourism. We're talking about things like out-of-control short-term rentals that push residents out. Second, you have to find creative ways to adapt historic buildings for modern life, dealing with things like accessibility. And third, the big one, you have to systematically remove private cars from city centers.
And the coolest part is, this is not just some theoretical wish list. This is really happening. France has a whole national program called Action Cœur de Ville to bring life back to its historic town centers. We already saw how Ghent has created this amazing car-free core, and the whole global 15-minute city movement is built on these exact same principles. They're all modern versions of this neo-medieval roadmap.
So let's pull all these different threads together, because this leads us to the final big idea. And it's an idea that's about way more than just urban planning. It's really a blueprint for our collective survival.
And here it is. This is the crucial point. Human scale isn't just an aesthetic. It's not just about how a place looks or feels. It is an entire socioeconomic operating system. It fundamentally changes how we interact with each other, how our economy works, and how we use resources. It is a total, fundamental shift.
As we stare down a future with serious resource constraints and huge demographic changes, the medieval city model gives us this remarkably smart roadmap. It's compact, so it uses less energy and less land. It's cohesive, so it builds the strong social ties we need to be resilient. And it's complex, creating these diverse local economies that can handle shocks. This isn't about retreating to the past. It's about using our most proven strategy to build a viable future.
Which leaves all of us with the final challenge. The goal here isn't to perfectly preserve our cities in amber, like they're museums. It's about making them into dynamic, living, breathing places for people to thrive in today. So the real question we all have to ask ourselves is this: how do we make our cities for life, not just for memory?